thank you to the speakers, as can happen with these kinds of conferences that are organised around some central question. Very occasionally, a great diversity of answers leads to a kind of emergent consensus, and I think that's definitely happened here. And Donovan, where's he gone? Oh, there he is. Donovan, I make no apologies for putting you together with John Headley Brooke. You fully justified your billing, I think, in my opinion, so thank you very much for that. Are there limits to science? This is how we began, and I think the answer I have gleaned from this is yes and no. That seems to be the gist, with a particular emphasis falling on the yes, there are limits. And I just want to try to expand what I mean by that by kind of talking through the talks. So much of the discussion has focused on naturalism, this thing that I said I'm quite interested in, as a kind of a bucket to contain science. So if science has limits, then it's naturalism that defines them. But in everything that we've heard, naturalism is clearly nothing if not ambitious. After all, just to speak of naturalism, whatever of the many versions we're thinking of, is to include everything natural to begin with. Now, in its most metaphysical form, what Fiona Ellis referred to as scientific naturalism, so that's what I'll use from now on. Of course, as you know, science is said to be competent to explain everything natural to such an extent that there is nothing supernatural, nothing outside of the natural, nothing outside science. Science has no limits. And as you know, that kind of naturalism tends to be sufficiently reductionist that those who follow the inexorable logic of it through usually find themselves in the position where the most real thing in the universe, the realist reality, is the laws of physics. Now, of course, there's a question as to whether physicists actually believe this themselves, and this physicist, for one, does not believe that. And so many of us react to a kind of rampant scientific imperialism that we detect in these positions, and we want to say, no, science does have limits. There are things it can't explain, even in the natural world, such as values, emotions, subjective experiences, Beethoven's sonatas. And of course, that was the basis for Fiona's case for what she referred to as expansive naturalism. And she made this, what I thought was a really ingenious argument, that attempts to include all of the attempts you might make to include non-scientific realities, like values and emotions and Beethoven, are not unlike the attempts that theism makes to kind of make bridges between God and the natural world. So her version of expansive naturalism is even bigger than scientific naturalism. It has even fewer limits, if you like. So expansive naturalism is even more ambitious than scientific naturalism. Now, Michael Liedenhag, now he took an even broader view, if you like, because he looked at several of these kinds of expansive naturalisms, and he made, I thought, a really valuable point that often these naturalisms make a kind of, they rely on a kind of placement strategy. They're schemes to smuggle in things that we hold really dear past the kind of customs and excise of scientific naturalism, and we hope that the laws of physics will be looking the other way while we kind of get on with enjoying our Beethoven, for instance. But all of these placement strategies, he explained, have placement problems as a result. So we can't own up to these things that we hold most dear, like Beethoven in naturalism, without actually effectively, owning up to the fact we can't really explain them, effectively admitting that we're guilty of dualism. And dualism is, after all, the unforgivable sin in the kingdom of the naturalists. Well, Mikhail suggested that we should, in fact, just see ourselves as heading in a kind of a post-naturalism direction and sort of stop worrying too much about it. It's time to embrace dualism and theological perspectives. Well, that brings me to another angle to this question of are there limits to science, and that is, are there limits to religion? Now, I think the answer here seems to be a very firm no for anyone who holds their religious beliefs dearly, especially if you see science as encroaching upon those beliefs. And I think one's tendency here is not to let science encroach, but actually to embrace it with an even wider view, if you like, to make religion still wider than science. So if science has limits in a kind of theistic view of naturalism, religion certainly doesn't. And Sarah Lane Ritchie explored this stance in various ways. Of course, she spent much of her time looking at the causal joint, which is more or less by definition almost the kind of limit to science where it meets the limit to religion. And she concluded by avoiding or getting away from that issue by looking at what she referred to as the theological turn in divine action. Of course, this moves away from talking about limits of science or religion by almost sort of merging theism and naturalism. And of course, she mentioned what is, to my mind, one of the best solutions of all time to these problems by Thomas Aquinas, where all natural causes are primarily divine causes. And of course, she mentioned that famous quote of John Polkinghorne. Much as I admire him, I don't admire this quote of his. I see it as a kind of a swipe at the Thomistic perspective, where he sees it as an unintelligible kind of theological doublespeak. Well, it always strikes me that Thomas actually offers one of the most intelligible solutions in a very unintelligible area. But nevertheless, I know that Sarah doesn't agree with me on this, so I don't want to sort of brand her with anything to do with that. But just to say that she offered a kind of another perspective by going on to talk about the more enchanted versions of naturalism than those of Thomas, including Chris Knight's panentheistic vision, some pneumatological visions, all as kind of experimental alternatives which see the limits of science as embraced by God's wholeness. And what I took her as suggesting was that all of these can be seen as kind of thought experiments, or even kind of faith experiments, really. They don't solve the problems of explaining divine action, and I took from her the point that all of these theistic naturalisms are in effect mirror images of the problems that scientific naturalism faces. What are the laws of nature? How competent are they to explain all causes we might want to talk about? What do we do with spooky things like values and Beethoven? The problems are just the same, you see, the mirror images of the two. So the problem of how we explain divine action in a faith position actually mirrors the problem of how do we deny divine action in scientific naturalism. Now, of course, I said nothing yet about Chris Southgate and his amazing Gowland lecture on the limits of science from a poet's perspective. If the sciences use limited human language to explore greater truths about the universe, then so does poetry, of course. It exploits the limitations of language. And so he so ably demonstrated, I thought, the way that poetry can transcend the limitations of human language every bit as much as the most awe-inspiring scientific discovery. So there's something very interesting there about human language limitations in both science and a kind of a spooky area like poetry. Also, of course, a very interesting point is that Chris showed us how poetry can act in a prophetic and warning mode to urge limitations upon science, where science is perhaps overreaching itself. And in our culture, where science is so far in the ascendant that its terminology and methodology becomes kind of all pervasive, it's perhaps creative, spooky arts like poetry and music that can point to the limits of science more clearly than anything else. And Donovan, right at the end, I think did a wonderful job of reminding us of this point of how our emotions, very, very spooky of course, lead our science. We can't assume that the former, emotions, can simply be explained away by the latter, by the science. Rather, our emotions truly lead our science. Well, the question that naturally arises from all of this sort of latter part of focus on values and spookiness and Beethoven and so on, I think takes us from the question of are there limits to science to the question of should science actually be limited? Very interesting question which brings ethics into the arena, and Neil Messer very helpfully helped us with some of the issues there especially from the perspective of neuroscience, cognitive science. He was looking at the human brain, and of course much of our discussion we've slowly begun to realise that what's often said to be the most complex entity in the universe, the human brain, is also the place where the limits of science and religion come together most fascinatingly, sometimes most violently. And so, of course, this leads me on to the subject of the next conference next year in Lincoln, same dates. It looks increasingly like we're going to explore this issue of the human mind, its well-being and its limitations. And so, simply, I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you very much.